Again, I was talking just before the talk that I'm still just an old country boy from Eastern North Carolina, and that's never left me, and it's still a part of who I am. So as I kind of talk about this today, I think you'll hear where I'm coming from with it, and hopefully you'll follow me well. Also a very good night, because as a Buckeye, we win last night, and so we're very happy about that as well in the Buckeye Nation, as well as my love for the state of North Carolina. Those are two great loves. So I'm going to start the presentation, and I already knew that there were some connections between Native peoples here in this region and the group that I study broadly in North Carolina. Some of you watched some of my presentations, some of you are familiar with some of the stuff that I've done, but I would ask groups oftentimes, when you think of Native Americans of North Carolina, what is the group, or what are the groups that you usually think of, right? Give me a name. So a lot of different names, but generally audiences, and you all are down here in this region, so you of course know other groups, but it would be Cherokees and Lumbees that would come up the most. But people who know Tuscaroras and have some connections or understand something about their history would mention them as well, but rarely did they mention them. And like I said, I grew up in Bertie County in Indian Woods, which was the old Tuscarora Reservation, again, established in 1717, and we were Cherokees. Our ancestors, grandma was part Cherokee, right? So we never understood, who the Tuscaroras were, and I never had a full understanding of who the Tuscaroras were, or all the Native groups that were here in this part of the state until later. And really, it was being at North Carolina Central and taking a North Carolina history course, and I'll be brief because I don't want to take away from the presentation. But I took a North Carolina history course, read Leffler and Newsom's book on the history of a southern state, two great professors out of Chapel Hill, and they mentioned in the first couple of pages, in the first chapter, my community, Indian Woods by name. And I said to myself, we didn't know anything much about our community other than we've always been from there, and I knew all my family and all my people, but we didn't know very much about the history of the area beyond our family lore and family stories. And I said to myself, if this is significant enough to be in this book by these two great Carolina scholars, then it must be significant. And I spent the rest of my career and life researching and writing and gathering as much information as I possibly could about Native peoples in the state, particularly Tuscaroras in the state, and those people down here in Eastern North Carolina. So I'll start there, and I'll go, one of the great things about our region, and it's our region, Eastern North Carolina, is the fact that it hasn't been overly developed. And so a lot of our heritage and history is still rooted in this land and in this area. Whereas other parts of the state, Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham, Greensboro, are really growing rapidly. And we know our state, when I left the state to go to school and teach out of the state, it has doubled in size since I've come back. Lots of people from other states are migrating here, and we're the 10th largest state now out of the 50 in terms of growth and growing. And so those of us who have deep roots in the state and have a heritage and a history that goes back for hundreds of years, I'm talking 300-400 years, it's imperative that we preserve that heritage and that history, and that we share that heritage and that history with these newcomers and with others, including ourselves. Because oftentimes you can't see the forest for the trees. You assume, or you don't really value those things that you should value. So I'm hoping that this presentation will do some of that today and help us kind of talk about these Native peoples here and the impact that they've had on this region and had on our state here in North Carolina. So I typically, when I try to do a talk, make it relevant. So one of the things that I did here is zoom in on Eastern North Carolina and talk about the core and the Noose. And it's important to understand that the core and the Noose Indians actually are connected to the Indians that I study, the Tuscaroras, and I'm going to explain why in this presentation as we go forward. If we talk about the core and the Noose Indians, they are one of several groups of Indians that are in our region that are of Iroquois origin. In North Carolina, when we think about the Iroquois Indians, they're highlighted in yellow here. we would think of the Maharans, the Tuscaroras, the Nottaways, who straddled the border between Virginia and North Carolina. And then in this region, we would think of and we would talk about the Core and the Neuse Indians. There are a host of other Indians in coastal North Carolina, northeastern North Carolina, the Albemarle Sound region. When we talk about the Choanokes, or we talk about the Bear River or Bay River Indians, we talk about the Pamlico Indians. All of those Indians are Algonquin-speaking peoples, but they were always confederated with the Tuscaroras and with the Core Indians that were in this region. The little I read about, a couple of articles that I got to see an article before this talk, we know that the Core, the Neuse, the Bear River or Bay River Indians, the Machapunga Indians, all of these Indians were confederated with the Tuscarora Indians at the start of the Tuscarora War. And that war was as much about, control of this region between the newcomers, the English, and the other settlers that were coming in, and the native populations that were here. But they have collectively shared a heritage and shared a history that is really hundreds of years old. But who are the Core Indians? If we talk about these people, who are they? And Iroquois Indians, the Tuscaroras, the Maharans, the Nottaways, as well as the Core Neuse Indians, they are what we call the Haudenosaunee people. That is their native name for themselves. We call them Iroquois. It was a name given to them by the French. But their native name is Haudenosaunee.
What does Iroquois mean?
Now, people of the Longhouse. Now, Iroquois means rattlesnake.
Rattlesnake.
That means rattlesnake.
Like Sioux.
Right. That was given to them by the French. But Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse. Okay. So if we talk about these individuals and we talk about who they are, it's important to understand that the Iroquois people are an ancient people. And when I say they're ancient, I mean thousands of years old. They go back to the ancient city of Cahokia. If you know the Midwest and been in the Midwest, St. Louis, and across the river from St. Louis, East St. Louis, if you travel in the river in that region, Cahokia still exists. You can go to the city of Cahokia, you can walk up the mounds. They are earthen mounds designed just like the Aztec pyramids in Central and South America, just made out of earth. They lived and resided in that region, and they came to that region, ancient history, from Central America and Mexico, and moved there and lived there for thousands of years. And then there was some great catastrophe, some great natural disaster. According to oral tradition, a great flood. Can a natural disaster displace people? We've seen it multiple times in our history. We saw it with Hurricane Katrina, which devastated the city of New Orleans and scattered people out of New Orleans who have never come back home. And so this great disaster caused the people to migrate from Cahokia into the Northeast, into what became New York State. And then in New York State, what was one people, the Haudenosaunee, split into several nations of people, including the Mohawks, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Senecas, the Oneidas, Tuscaroras, even the Cherokees at one point were a part of them, but separated out as they migrated south. So one people become multiple nations of Indians, but we refer to the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois as the 5 nations, later the 6 nations when the Tuscaroras, who were originally from North Carolina, originally from New York, migrate to North Carolina, then return home after the Great Tuscarora War. But they are an ancient people. So when we talk about the Core and Neuse people, it's important to understand that the Core and Neuse people are an ancient people connected to the ancient Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people who predate for thousands of years their existence in the Midwest, then in New York State, then here in the Carolinas, and they occupy this region of eastern North Carolina. How do they come here? They migrate down the Appalachian Valley, down the Shenandoah Valley, to the Roanoke River Valley, the city of Roanoke in Virginia. They come down following the Roanoke River, down from the road from the valley, from Roanoke. They settle along the Roanoke River, along the Maharan River, along the Nottoway River and eventually down into the Albemarle area, interacting with the other native peoples that are in what became known as Albemarle County, but the Albemarle area, which include the Choanokes and the other Indians that were in that region. They continue to move south along the Tar River, along the Neuse River, and out towards the Pamlico Sound and the swampy areas of eastern North Carolina in Hyde County, what is Hyde County, Dare County, Terrell County, but throughout those areas, and they populate and they settle along all of the major rivers in eastern North Carolina, heading as far south as the Cape Fear River in southeastern North Carolina. So, pretty much everything north of the Cape Fear River, east from the coastal region, westward up to the foothills, the Piedmont, into the mountains, but following the flow of the river. Between the Roanoke, Meharon rivers and the Cape Fear River, the source of the Cape Fear River is up in the Guilford County, Forsyth County, Wake County area, and drains down into this area. So all throughout the coastal plains of North Carolina and the Piedmont were the ancient hunting grounds and territories of the Tuscarora and their allies who end up in this part of North Carolina. And they were Iroquois people. So when I talk to people about nations and Iroquois people, I'm gonna take my coat off. Okay. I dress too warmly. I have my long underwear on. I'm an old man and I can't take the cold too well, but I overdress for being inside and then being up here talking. But they are Iroquois people, right? So Iroquois, remember now, they're Haudenosaunee people in their language, but they're Iroquois people in the language of the French and of course adopted by the English. Iroquois, Algonquin, Muskegon, they're language groups like French, English, Dutch, Spanish, or Portuguese, which means that all of the Indians within a particular language group, Iroquois, all communicate with each other and speak the same language. The same way the Australians, the folks in England, us here in America, and the British Islands, we all speak the same language, but it's not exactly the same. We use some different words, we have different accents, but we can all understand each other because it's the same language. The Iroquois do the same. So the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Senecas, the Tuscaroras, the Core, the Neuse, the Meharons, the Nottoways, they all speak the same language. They're all part of the same people. They all originate in the same place. So they all have a culture and an alliance with one another, and they interact with one another. In fact, the Tuscaroras were the largest group in North Carolina and most powerful group in North Carolina. And to trade, you had to speak Tuscarora. That was the trading language. Like English is the trading language, or French became the universal language for diplomacy, right? So the Iroquois language, or the language of the Haudenosaunee, was the language that other Indian nations spoke to trade and interact with one another and confederate with one another. As I mentioned before, the ancient people who became the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois, they were ancient. They had existed at Cahokia thousands of years. Cahokia was one of the largest cities in the world. And they existed in Cahokia for more than 1,000 years before they migrated east and then created what became known as the Iroquois Confederation, which was a democracy and which was the most powerful Indian confederation in the history of North America. When we think of great native civilizations in the Western Hemisphere, we think of the Aztecs, the Incas, we think of the Mayans, we think of the Pueblos, we think of the Anasazi, we think of the Iroquois and the great confederation and alliance that they had, which becomes what we consider the United States and the US Constitution, they call the Great Law. And that they are united with one another, and they protect one another, and they defend one another. So it's important to understand that when we talk about the Core and the Neuse, and we talk about the Iroquois and the Haudenosaunee, that the peoples that lived in this area who were Iroquois and by default Haudenosaunee, and connected to the Tuscaroras and this great diaspora. They were some of the most ancient and most significant native peoples and cultures in North America. Okay, yes.
You mentioned the Confederacy and the Iroquois Confederacy. I just read yesterday about, have you heard of Condiarook?
So I know a little, but what I'm gonna do, because I've done this before, I'm gonna wait and take all questions at the end, because I did this once before, because I try to be respectful and let the questions come in,
Okay.
but it'll take away from the presentation for others. But I hold the question and we'll talk about it when I'm done, okay? So it's important to understand, and one of the things I try to do, I said before, I'm just an old country boy, so you gotta make it make sense to me, right? Try to make it plain, is that what I try to do is make it plain, and I hope I've done that, right? In a very brief way. You're asking me to tell you hundreds of years of histories in a few minutes, right? But hopefully you get the significance of what I'm talking about. And you can clearly see from the anthropological, archaeological record why I say the Indians here are connected to the Iroquois and by default to the Haudenosaunee, right? And we understand that the other Indians, some of whom were Algonquin-speaking peoples in the coastal areas, like the Machapunga, the Bear River, the Pamlico, the Mattamuskeet, were confederated with the Tuscaroras and the Core and the Noose, and remained confederated with them through the time of the Tuscarora War and after the Tuscarora War. So it's important to understand, and we need to understand their relationship with the other nations of Indians that were around them, okay? So the Tuscaroras have been left out of North Carolina history. Tuscaroras are not thought about and talked about in North Carolina history. We know about the Cherokees, and the Cherokees were in Tennessee. They were in the mountains in Tennessee, between the mountains of Tennessee and the Mississippi River. That's their homeland. And the Cherokees were heavily, intermixed and intermarried with the Creeks. So it's important to understand that the most dominant group of Indians in North Carolina, unfortunately, were not really talked about in North Carolina, and a huge part of our history has been left out. Much less in our region down here in eastern North Carolina, people understanding the dynamics and the relationships between these Indian peoples and how they confederated, how they held alliance, how they held, trade with one another. That has pretty much been lost to history. So it's imperative upon us to not only document, preserve, but communicate that history to other folks, particularly as our state is rapidly changing. Most of you probably have seen these early maps of, early Tuscarora settlements. At one time, Tuscaroras were scattered all over eastern North Carolina. This is pretty much their homeland and their range from north of the Cape Fear River up into Virginia when you include the Nottaways and the Meharans. And there are major towns scattered along the banks of these major rivers draining out of the Piedmont of North Carolina. But again, through disease and conflict, and primarily disease, beginning as early as Spanish contact in the late 1400s and early 1500s, what we see happening is that the region gets depopulated. Disease wipes out whole groups of people. And so there are fewer and fewer. So from the 1500s to the 1600s to the 1700s, at the start of the Tuscarora War, what was a region that was heavily populated by Tuscaroras and other Indian groups, by the time we get to the 1700s and the start of the Tuscarora War, the region has been depopulated. So it's important to understand that when we talk about the history of this area and we talk about the peoples that are in this area, it's important to understand the Tuscaroras and their influence over the region. Now, I put this in to just kind of talk a little bit about Tuscarora culture, and also check me on time-wise if I'm running too long, so check me. Okay, all right. So, it's important to understand that the Tuscaroras basically have a clan structure, and it's very important for me to explain this clan structure for you all as well. So, at least by the time of the Tuscarora War, which was the map that I just previously showed, we know that there were at least 7 clans. The clans basically are given to groups of Tuscaroras that live in areas that have an abundance of a particular type of wild game. So you have the deer clan because there's lots of deer. You have the bear clan because there are lots of bear. You have the beaver clan, eel clan. You know, all these different clans, you know, are associated with a particular type of game that was very prevalent in the territories and in the areas in which they live. The clans are headed by clan mothers. The clan mothers are the oldest living women of rank. The Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, are matriarchal, which means the bloodlines run through the women. It doesn't matter who the father of a child is. It matters if the child was the child of a Tuscarora woman. And so because of that, the bloodline is shared, you know, from generation to generation. The clan mothers, these oldest living women of rank, maintain these clans, and they go down from generation to generation to generation. So it's important to understand that when we talk about, you know, the Tuscaroras in eastern North Carolina, and we talk about these different community structures, they are a nation that is made up of kinships and made up of families. In other words, from the perspective of the Haudenosaunee and of the Tuscaroras, it doesn't matter if you're the first Tuscarora or you are the 10,000th Tuscarora. All of the Tuscaroras are kin. They all trace their ancestry through a matriarchal line and a common female ancestor, and they all are related and connected by blood. Now, this map shows you the road systems in eastern North Carolina. And the reason why that's there is because I want you to also understand that many of the roads here in eastern North Carolina, whether we're talking about 70, 64, 264, 258, 158, 12, it doesn't make any difference. All of the roads, North Carolina routes, and some US routes like US 1, they were all Native American trading paths before they became roads. All that the English did is they dug ditches along these trading paths, cut the trees back, and drained the roads off, and then they paved the roads in the 20th century so that they could be passable. But all of the major roads in eastern North Carolina running north, south, and east to west were Indian trading paths. And as you can see from this map here of 70, you see how 70 curves into Craven County, Carteret County, basically where the core and the noose were, and then it curves back out and goes over towards New Bern, and New Bern was the capital of the Tuscarora Confederacy. And so what we see is that the whole region is interconnected with a whole host of communities, and many of them, like if we talk about Grifton, North Carolina, which is near where one of the Tuscarora major towns were. If we talk about Browntown over in Greene County and Fort Neoroka, where it's located. If we talk about my area, Indian Woods up in Bertie County, off of Highway 11 and also Highway 13 and 17. All of these roads interconnect all of these old Native communities, which today now are North Carolina towns, where we have individuals who, in some cases, are descendants of these early peoples that were here many, many years ago. But it doesn't just stop in eastern North Carolina. These trading paths that start here in coastal North Carolina and in this region extend across the state of North Carolina, extend northward as far north as Canada and New York, and they extend westward as far west as Memphis. When I lived in Memphis, we were there for about 10 years. We lived in a place called Lakeland, which was right off of 64, where 64 and 70 intersected before it crossed the Mississippi River. I got on the road and rode it all the way from Memphis, all the way through Fayetteville, Tennessee, all the way through the mountains on the Devil's Tail, all the way back down, and came on back down because 64 goes right by Indian Woods in Bertie County, all the way back out to Roanoke Island and back to the Outer Banks to Nags Head. It's important to understand that the Tuscaroras had a sophisticated trade network that traded as far south as North Georgia and Florida, and as far north as Canada. And after the Tuscarora War, we call it the Tuscarora diaspora, they were scattered all over North Carolina and eastern North Carolina, all throughout Kentucky, all throughout West Virginia, Tennessee, eastern Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Canada. You can go to western Pennsylvania right now and go through the Tuscarora Mountains in Pennsylvania. You can go to the western part of Virginia, coming off of the Shenandoah, and you'll see Tuscarora County. You can go into eastern Ohio and near Youngstown, and you'll see Tuscarora County and Tuscarora Creek. And if you look at the old historic maps, and I've looked at thousands of them, you see the Tuscaroras all over, after the Great War, all over eastern North Carolina and even up into Canada. Large numbers of Tuscaroras after the war went to Montreal, to Ganawage, the Mohawk Reservation in Montreal. And they were baptized at the Mohawk Chapel. You can go to the Mohawk Chapel and see when they were baptized in 1713 and 1714 after leaving North Carolina during the Great Tuscarora War. So these were an expansive people. And after the war, we call it the diaspora. They were scattered all over the eastern United States and all over eastern North Carolina. So just an important thing to kind of understand when we talk about the nature of these people and the nature of their trade routes. One of the main things that they trade, and why one of the main reasons this region would have been important and significant to them, particularly the coastal areas, is seashells. I pointed out to people that Native Americans valued seashells in the same way that Europeans value gold and silver, diamonds, and precious stones, rubies. Seashells had great spiritual meaning to Native people. They used it as currency. They used it to make what we call wampum belts. Those wampum belts would be developed and designed with various patterns and designs, and the chiefs and the clan mothers, the oldest living people, could explain and read a wampum belt and tell you the history of a clan or the history of a group and the history of a nation. Those Indians that had access to the coast, to the ocean, where they could gather these seashells off the coast and then trade them as far north as New York and Canada, those nations were very prized and very valuable and very important to the Haudenosaunee and to the Iroquois. If we say, for example, what do I mean? I have a colleague at Cornell University. He wrote a book about the restoration of the Seneca, and he looked at the wampum trade amongst the Seneca, which dropped off in 1715 after the Tuscarora War. They excavated Seneca burial mounds in western New York State, and they find wampum seashells, wampum made with seashells from the Outer Banks of North Carolina. So it's important to understand how important the Indian peoples here, the Core, the Neuse, the Tuscarora Indians were to the Iroquois Confederation and to other Indian nations, because they traded with other Indian nations and they were seen as being a group of Indians who had access to wampum and to wampum belts, which made them extraordinarily important and significant. This is a map drawn by the French of the Iroquois in northeastern U.S. If you kind of read maps, you can probably see that in here. You can see clearly Manhattan Island. You can see Massachusetts. You can clearly see the Hudson River. You see the Iroquois longhouses in the back country. They were extraordinarily powerful and influential. The French feared and dreaded them. The English feared and dreaded them. They had a great deal of influence. And because of their relationship with the Tuscaroras here in North Carolina, they had a massive empire that stretched from the St. Lawrence River in Canada all the way down to the Cape Fear River. We know the relationship existed because the Virginians talk about in 1675 what they call the Seneca invasion, how the Senecas dominated all of the backcountry of Virginia. During Bacon's rebellion, Governor Berkeley put down Bacon, not just because of him trying to overthrow the government. He put down Bacon because the Five Nations threatened to destroy Virginia if the Indians that they were attacking, if he didn't stop attacking those Indians, because they were confederated with the Iroquois. So it's important to understand that the French, the English, the Dutch, the Swedes, they all were very familiar with who the Iroquois were, who the Haudenosaunee were, and they were very familiar with the fact, Governor Spotswood talks about it in the Tuscarora War, large numbers of Tuscaroras move up on the border between Virginia and North Carolina. He stays out of the war because, again, he's been threatened by the Six Nations, the Five Nations, that if they become involved in the war, that they would become involved in the war and would attack the Virginians all along the frontier, and they remain neutral. And hundreds of Tuscaroras move out of eastern North Carolina up into the border regions of Virginia, and then up into Roanoke, Virginia, through the Roanoke River Valley, and then up the Shenandoah Valley, retreating into Pennsylvania, and then eventually into New York State after the Tuscarora War. So, because of the nature of the talk and the release, the press release, I wanted to talk a little bit about also Native culture, and talk a little bit about the Haudenosaunee's culture. So their family, their political structure, their worldview in terms of, environmental views. I'm going to touch a little bit on that now in this part of the talk. The Haudenosaunee have a philosophy which they call, one bowl or one dish and one spoon. That when they ate, they all ate from the same dish, and they all used the same spoon. They would pass the food around so that everybody ate. They have a culture that really is very, responsive of the unity, that they have a family state. The Iroquois said that they had a confederation, and the Great Law was like a chain. It was unbreakable. If you attack one of the Iroquois, you attack them all. If you attack the Mohawks, then all of the Haudenosaunee would attack you. If you attack the Tuscarora, all of the Haudenosaunee and the allies will attack you. They were a family. They were all kin. And so it's important to understand that, the nature of these folks, when we talk about how they lived and how they responded to their environment, they did it from the perspective of their families. Their philosophy was for 7 generations, that the things that they planned for and the things that they did were not for themselves. They weren't for their children. They weren't for their grandchildren. They were for 7 generations yet unborn. Everything they did was for the future and for future generations, future children, so that they would be able to live in peace and be able to live a quality life. So it's important to understand that these drawings come from Ralph Lane and John White when they first came to eastern North Carolina in 1584 and 85, and they mapped the area. We see that they have a well-established community. We talk about our native people, were they civilized, or were this a wilderness, or all these things we talk about when we think of native cultures. But it was clearly demonstrated in the illustrations and the drawings that they had a well-ordered and well-structured community. We see religious buildings like churches. We see houses where families live. We see gardens and gardening practices that we still, if you're a native of North Carolina, my grandmother practiced, my mother practiced, we still practice growing corn, beans, squash, which are called the 3 sisters, which did not exist in Europe, which was learned from the native populations that were here. Even the white potato, it did not exist in Europe. They brought it back to Europe when they first came in 1584 and 85 and made contact with the coastal Indians. And as we know, with the white potato and the dependence on the potato as a food source, that it completely changed the course of history if we talk about the potato famine in Ireland. So it's important to understand that these native people have a culture, that is in existence, and it's in existence and in balance with nature. I'll mention one other piece. We talk about how our landscape has changed. And I have a couple of, I'm gonna try to walk through these illustrations, not being able to read all of the information, but I'm leaving the presentation with you all to share with those who are here today and anyone else who's interested. But if we talk about the landscape in our river systems, and we talk about the Albemarle Sound, and I got some really nice pictures of a nice picture of the Albemarle Sound that I will show in just a second. But native people, they hunted, they fished, they had small gardens where they grew agricultural commodities, but they didn't have large-scale farming, right? The English and many other Europeans coming from Europe had large farms. They cut the timber back, prepared the land, and they had large farms. Well, the problem with large farms is that there's a lot of runoff. Topsoil runs off. And it runs off into the creeks, and it runs off into the rivers, and it runs off into the sounds, and it clogs up the beds where the fish go to spawn. And so Europeans had decimated their natural landscape before they even left Europe to come to the Americas because of their farming practices. And then when they got to the Americas, they began to clear cut the timber and create massive farms to grow tobacco, and then later grow cotton, and all the sediment, all the topsoil just runs down and ran into the rivers and began to clog the rivers and clog the sounds. Now in our modern time, it's even worse than that, because now we have hog waste, and we have, chicken waste, and we have fertilizers, and we have herbicides, and everything is draining into our river systems and then draining down, along with the topsoil still being stripped and draining down into our waterways and down here into the coastal areas and into our sounds. So the relationship between nature and the people there, we already talked about their clan structures and how certain animals represented their clans. And they, of course, they cultivated these animals, deer, bear, beaver, the same way we cultivate cattle, and chickens. And they had wild turkeys and so forth, and wild duck. So they lived off of the land and off of the landscape, and these animals were very important to them and very important to their survival during this particular time period and this particular era. And that includes turtles, includes various types of fish, includes various types of eels. They lived off of the land, but they weren't doing it on an industrial scale, which we have been doing in this country since colonial times. There was industrial scale, shipping tobacco, shipping timber, shipping cotton back to Europe and to other parts of the British Empire. So we're overproducing things beyond what we need to exist and to survive. But native peoples, they didn't mass produce things in that way. They only produced what they needed to survive. And in that way, it was sustainable, and they were able to sustain the landscape. Using the landscape, making canoes. There was a question about how, because I'm answering some of your questions. The question about, how did they utilize the landscape? How did they make their canoes? Native people didn't have knives and axes, and I'm going to explain this in a second too. And when I say this generically, I'm talking about the core and the Neuse Indians of this region as well, right? Because they're Iroquois. We've already established this, right? So things I'm talking about is related to those Indians that were here. They didn't have knives and axes. So what they would do is they would set a fire around the root of a tree, a pine or a oak or whatever type of tree, and they would burn the tree down and then push it over. Then, using their axe heads, stone axe heads, they would carve out and burn out the center of the tree. So they've taken a whole tree that they've cut down, and now they're digging the center, the heart of the tree out, and burning the heart of the tree out to make a canoe. So it's one piece. It's not the way the Europeans build ships and the way they build things. It's one piece. So once they've hollowed it out, then they put it in the water, and that's their canoe. So they make their canoes, and then they use those canoes and flatboats to navigate the Albemarle Sound, which these illustrations, which were done by Ralph Lane and John White, shows you that the water was so clear you could see to the bottom of the sound. And you could see all the different fish that were there, all of the different kinds of fish that were there in the sound. You could see them, they could harpoon them. you all know from being in this region, whether we're talking about the Pamlico or the Albemarle Sound further up, there are parts of the sound that are so shallow that you can actually wade through, right? Some are very deep, but some areas are not. And only the native people, and I say native meaning you all who live in this area, you know where you can get your boats in and when you can't get your boats in, where they're going to run aground, where they're not going to run aground. But to know that at one time, the sounds were so clear and the waters were so clear that you could see to the bottom and see all the oysters and all the clams, all of the things that were there in the bottom of those sounds. And they were in such abundance, as you all know from being in this region, 12 that runs up and down the Outer Banks. They were built out of the seashells because there were mounds and mounds of seashells that the native people had from having clam roasts and oyster roasts out on the coast in the summertime. They just used those shells to originally build 12, which runs all along the Outer Banks. It makes me sad, and I'll speak to this while I'm looking at this. I grew up in Bertie County in eastern North Carolina, and just in my lifetime, from when I was a small child, the heron would run up the river in the millions. In the millions. And we would go out there on a boat, my dad and uncle, at night. We did it at night because on a full moon, because when they were running in the spring, you could see them reflecting through the water because they're silver. And we would get, with nets, a pickup bed truck full of fish in a matter of an hour or so. And I remember the landscape. We had wild plum trees, we had wild strawberries, we had apples and pears and peaches, we had our gardens with corn, beans, and squash, with cucumbers, with zucchini. We had our own hogs, we hunted, we had deer, venison, bear, turtle. I grew up dirt poor in eastern North Carolina, but I was never poor. I never wanted for anything. I never went hungry a day. Smokehouse was full of sausages and hams, fresh salted herons. Anything we wanted, we'd just go out there and we'd catch it, or we'd hunt it. We have lost a lot, those of us who know North Carolina intimately and know it well, and just in my lifetime. And I'm not that old, but I remember it as a child growing up and what we have lost. The last of these are just to, again, illustrate when we talk about animals, we talk about, moose and deer. I'll use this one when we talk about antlers. Antlers are important. Obviously, they hunted moose and deer, and they ate moose and deer. But the antlers were important because they call it, horning a chief. And I'll explain that ties into political and family again, right? So you remember I said they're a matriarchal society, right? So not only do the women carry the bloodline, the women selected the leaders. So the clan mothers got together and they decided who would be the chief. Now, I remember growing up as a child, my grandmother and mother, and then as I had my own children, I began to realize, you see these children, you see them growing up. You know which ones are bad. You know which ones are good and which ones are bad. And when you want to put someone in charge of something, you know which ones to put in charge and which ones you can't. The clan mothers raising the kids, they identify the ones who care the most about the people and about the family. They would horn them. They would take the antlers of a deer and they would make them the chief. And it was their responsibility to look after the people. Not themselves, because to be chief, you had to give away everything you own. You had to give away everything to be chief. How many people we know are going to be leaders to give away everything they have? Right? They had to give away everything they own, but they were richer when they were chief because they could go to anyone's home. They would be fed, they would be clothed. They were traveling between here and Bertie County, any place, Tarboro, anywhere along the way. They would stop, they would be given the best bed, given the best food, given the best clothing, and sent on the way to the next village because they were the chief of the nation. They wanted.
They were men.
They were men, but they were men who had been made chief by the women. And if the women didn't like what they had done, they dehorned them.
Objection.
My point is that when cultures come together, traditions change. Even native cultures and native peoples have altered some, but that was Haudenosaunee culture, Iroquois culture. That was the culture of native peoples. Seeds, again, many of the seeds that we're talking about, if we talk about, for example, and I'll split the four winds and go straight to the gifts of seeds. Many of the seeds that we talk about, the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people, and then people in eastern North Carolina, the different types of crops that they end up, strawberries, different types of corn, different types of beans, their understanding of different types of what they call medicines, different types of plants that could prevent pregnancy, that could stop any kinds of ailments. They had a very firm understanding and knowledge of this landscape and of the various plants that were in the landscape and what those various plants could and could not do. Again, this is just showing examples of the various types of crops that they cultivated and that they carried. I'm not going to spend time going over each one, but I'm just going through some of them very quickly. Different varieties of corn that they cultivated. The point I'm making with a lot of these plants, if we take corn, for example, particularly corn, and if we talk about tobacco, because tobacco was used originally as ceremonial, it was called a medicine, and it was used for spiritual reasons and for medical reasons. We turned it into an industry, right? And we, created cigarettes and, cigars, and we made it into a multi-billion-dollar industry. But native people, had it not been for native people with that crop, it would not have existed. It did not exist in Europe. It was introduced to the Europeans by the Native Americans. But if we take corn, for example, and the various varieties of corn, corn was a crop that had to be cultivated by humans, because the only way for the corn to really cultivate, you got to take it off the cob. And then you plant the individual seeds, and then each year when you harvest it, you keep some of the seeds, and then you replant the seeds to grow the corn. And then you can crossbreed different kinds of corn to create different types and different varieties of corn. So Native Americans basically create corn. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have corn. They brought corn with them from Central America and Mexico. They brought it up. We know the genetic lineage of corn comes up through Mexico, comes up into the Southwest and Arizona, comes across into Cahokia, then from Cahokia to New York State, and then from New York State down into North Carolina. But it was a crop that was cultivated by Native Americans, and if they did not, plant the corn, take the corn off the cob, keep the seeds, transport the seeds, replant the corn, crossbreed the corn, we wouldn't have corn today. And as you know, corn feeds the world today. We produce it and send it all over the world, and people grow it now all over the world. But it was here in America, and groups like the Tuscaroras and the Core and the Neuse who maintained and cultivated corn crops. And we talk about beans, all the different variety of beans, kidney beans, lima beans, pinto beans, navy beans, peas, field peas, all the different types of beans, again, cultivated by native people, brought and shared by native people, and then expanded, as natives moved from different locations and different regions. And we take these things for granted today. Again, my grandmother's garden, my mother's garden, I would ask my mother oftentimes when I was a young boy, I said, well, Mama, why do we do this? She said, because Mom did it. Mom was her mother. She said, Mom did it. I said, why did Mom do this? She said, because Mom did it. That's her grandmother's mom. Mom did it. I said, why did Mom do it? Because Mom's Mom did it, and that's the way we're gonna do it, so stop asking me questions. The point is that what I found is that so many traditions and customs that we think are African American or European are actually Native American, and were transferred to us, and we have carried them on, cooking traditions, gardening, habits and behaviors. We have passed them on from generation to generation, and we don't even know why we did these things, but they were transferred somewhere when we were blending cultures. Because in Virginia and here in North Carolina, early white settlers took native women as wives. You can't trade with native people. You couldn't trade with the Haudenosaunee unless you were kin. The only way you could become kin is you had to take one of their women as your wife. So many early traders who lived in Virginia and came down into eastern North Carolina had a white family in Virginia, wife and kids, but then married a native woman down here and had kids with her. And while we have a lot of blending and mixing down here in eastern North Carolina and throughout the Carolinas. Now that's a historical fact. That's what happened. And then, of course, through enslavement, you get mixing between blacks and Indians. There are three ways it happens. A whole lot of white indentured servants who came over from England didn't want to be indentured servants, because indentured servants, for all intent and purposes, were slaves. They were peasants in Europe and were slaves of Europe. And they come here and they're slaves, and they don't want to do that work, so they run away. Well, when they run away, they run into the frontier or into the Great Dismal Swamp or into the Alligator Swamp, or they run where the Indians are, and then the Indians take them in. And then the Indians start to intermix with them. The African slaves do the same thing. They run away, and they go into the swamps, and they go where the Indians are, and the Indians take them in. Because the Indians are a community. They are a collective. And you can only survive if everybody is doing their part. You need people to work together collectively to survive. Anybody who grew up on a farm, y'all know what I'm talking about. We all worked together. When there was a hog killing, we all had a job to do. We killed that hog, we dressed that hog, we cut those hams, we made our own barbecue, we made our own sausages. We hung those hams, we hung those sausages. When it's time for the fish run, I told you we get those herring out of the river. We all had to get together as a family, and we clean those herring, we scale those herring, cut the heads off, put them in salt, pack them, smoke them, hang them on a line and smoke them. You don't work, you don't eat. If you grew up on a farm like I did, you know how to work. So it's important to understand that when we talk about these cultures and we talk about the landscape, whether we're talking about corn, beans, squash, potatoes, all of these things were native in origin. All of these things the Europeans learned about when they got here and made contact with the Indians that were in this area, including the Core and the Noose and the Tuscaroras and the others. They learned these things. They liked the food. They liked the ways. They liked the women. They liked the men or whatever, and we end up with what we have today. We want to make it seem like it was always a well-segregated society, but it always was not. Maybe amongst the elite, but not amongst the masses of people. Because I was talking to a fellow the other day, we were talking about the turpentine industry down in southeast North Carolina, about tar and pitch and how we got the name Tar Heel. And he was like, my folk didn't own no slave, we were just trying to make it. We were cutting trees and poking them and getting that tar out. And we came home dirty and all full of tar. And that's just how it was. With Scotch-Irish folks come over from England trying to make a living, right? A lot of folks trying to make a living. This misunderstanding of what our early history and culture was, and most people just wanted to be left alone. They had come from a bad situation back in Europe. They wanted to come here and be left alone. And this region allowed for that to happen because of the Outer Banks and the treacherous waterways of this region, because there could not be heavy shipping coming in and out. And so they moved up to Virginia and they moved down to Charleston, South Carolina, and most of the people in this area were left alone. So the Indian people, the white people, the blacks, they end up merging and creating a culture that in some ways was very unique and very different, although we still have separate Native communities and separate white communities and African American communities. There's a whole lot of blending that takes place in this region. Okay, all right. I want to put this last piece up here for the ecological piece as well, because it touches on how Native Americans basically grew the agricultural goods. And we talk about sustainability and how they sustain the landscape, right? So whenever they planted, they called it the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. They always planted them together. So you planted the corn, and as the corn stalk grew up, you planted the beans around the corn, and the bean stalk winds around the corn stalk and goes up, and then you can pick the beans off the stalk, right? And then you can pick the corn. And then you planted the squash around the roots with the beans and the corn, and again, the squash thrived. Each of those crops also gave off nutrients for the other crop. So you didn't need fertilizers, right? So the corn is feeding off the nitrogen and whatnot's being put in the soil by the squash, being put in the soil by the beans and by the corn. They all are harmonious. They all coexist. They all thrive together. You have a healthy crop, and you feed your family and your village, your community, and you move on. So it's important to understand that when we talk about this, and I'm gonna wind it down there, and I'll just stop with that. I won't get into this because I think I've already gone over time and said more than
15 minutes.
15 minutes, because it's important to understand, that if we talk about, and I'm trying to merge all the things that were talked about and that I know you came here to hear about, I'm trying to merge them all together into one compact presentation. And I do teach a course on Tuscarora history, but that's a semester, right? It takes a whole semester to talk about, the history of Native Americans in North Carolina. So I'm trying to condense it for you, and I hope I'm doing that in a decent way, making it straightforward, helping you understand why it's relevant and why it's important, in a straightforward way. I think I'm going to move to the end of my presentation because there was one other thing that because I've been reading your news and reading stuff, and since I've come down, and I want to make one other point. So I'm going to go all the way to the end. So you just see these a whole nother presentation, right? So I'm just going to go to the end because there's one piece I did want to touch on. I'm backing up to this one. I'll keep going. Those illustrations were to talk about my home area of Indian Woods and how I know there's similar patterns even out here in Carteret County of, cultural blending, right? So you see in Indian Woods a lot of cultural blending. I mean, I have cousins, who have green eyes, blue eyes, gray eyes, all different shades of color. Some are dark, some are light, some could pass for white. It's all over the board. We've always been all over the board, going all the way back, but even up until the present day. But I read something and I said, well, I'll throw this in just for the benefit of anyone who might be here who's having that discussion, saying, well, why do we care about this stuff? Why do we care about these old burial grounds? Why do we care about, what was here? Does it matter? What can we do with that? Well, what we're doing with our history and culture back in Bertie County and in Indian Woods, and we have buy-in, white, black alike, we all have buy-in. And even Martin County now, I've been giving several talks in Martin County, and I've given some talks in Greene County, given some talks in other counties nearby, is the history of this blending of Native, African, and European peoples. Native Americans didn't speak English. That's a blending. They learned English from the Europeans. Native Americans were not Christians. They weren't Baptists. They weren't Methodists. They learned that from the Europeans. The English did not eat corn, beans, and squash, and did not, do the things that they're doing. They learned that from the Indians, right? So our cultures are blended, Native, African, and European, and it is about what makes us Southern, what makes us American, what makes us North Carolinians. Because here in North Carolina, we're different. Now, we're different here in Eastern North Carolina. We're different than the folks up in the Piedmont and up there in Raleigh and then Greensboro and then Charlotte. When I get up past Durham and I start heading to Charlotte, I don't even feel the same. That was back in college. When I went to college, it don't even feel right. Charlotte just didn't even feel right. It wasn't like home. But when I come east of 95, when I come back down and I hit Rocky Mountain, I come down east, northeast, from Virginia down to this region, this is home. And we share a culture and we share an identity. And that identity and that culture has been forged over hundreds of years. It doesn't mean that there haven't been some negative things that have happened. Doesn't mean that it's all good, but we are unique. And I think it's something worth fighting for. I think it's something worth valuing. I think it's something that we should be proud of. And so what we've tried to do in our area is to talk about that history, that long history of Africans, Native Americans, and Europeans, and what it means, and how the Tuscarora and the native groups that are in our area, the impact that they had on our development and the development of our area, and by default, the development of our state. Because I do think it is a shame that when you talk about the history of the state of North Carolina, you talk about only the Cherokees and only the Lumbees, when historically, and all of the documents and all of the historic maps bear it out, that the group that was here with the Haudenosaunee were the Tuscaroras, and the core, the new are Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people. How do we leave these people out? And then many of us who are from the area, and you start digging around too much, asking grandma too many questions, you might find out that you got a little native mixed in to your family tree. We find that up in Bertie County when people start doing the DNA 23andMe, white, black, or Indian, they're coming up, white, black, and Indian. Everybody's coming up mixed. If you've been here, if you're saying you're a North Carolinian and you've been here for hundreds of years like my ancestors, that's what we're coming up, So I'm going to stop there. I'm showing you some illustrations from project when I was at A&T and that we've transferred to Central, of how we're trying to promote and work with Bertie County and communities in Eastern North Carolina to document and promote their history and their connections with Native people and Native cultures in the region. We've had great buy-in and great support in various counties and areas in Eastern North Carolina, and it's just to give you an example of some of the things that you could think about and that you could possibly do when you talk about this rich history and culture that we have here in Eastern North Carolina. And I'm going to stop there, and I'll entertain questions, or I'm deferring. Whichever is best, whatever you all like to do, because I'm open for questions, so whenever
we
you
got
like
about
to do.
8 minutes for questions, so let's go ahead and, or I'll let you kind of pick.
Wait, don't matter, you do that, no, you go ahead, you can fix it, go ahead. You're done,
fine.
you go ahead. So,
Dr. Smallwood, thank you so much. I'm just